So Syria's Al-Assad regime is gone, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has taken control of the country. Americans and Israelis have been bombing Damascus, and Israelis have also begun their illegal invasion of Syria to capture more land beyond Golan Heights that it already illegally occupies. Clearly, many people are excited and celebrating the fall of a tyrant, saying that this was a brutal regime and it ought to have been crushed for the sake of humanity and peace in the region. But here are some snippets that would give you some idea already on the larger game plan behind toppling Assad.
How would he explain and legally justify that having waited 5 decades to be free of Assad, that on day one, those Syrians that he referenced in his statement, who were on the streets cheering the demise of Assad, were on the receiving end of a massive Israeli airstrike? Good question.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that I did speak to my Israeli counterpart yesterday. I do think it's right to understand that there are legitimate security concerns for Israel, particularly in the context of a country that's housed ISIS.
I want to ask you very quickly on Syria regarding Jolani. Is the bounty on his head still operative? If somebody were to turn him today, we would collect millions of dollars.
I would have to take that back.
Okay, let me move on.
Regarding the Israel strikes on Damascus, you mentioned the importance of, destroying chemical weapons stockpiles. But is the U.S. certain that is Israel actually really targeting the chemical weapons? Nothing else? Because there were some reports saying that Israel, in the buildings Israel targeted in Damascus. Was Assad's intelligence office, for instance. Is the U.S. aware of this?
I don't have any assessment of their strikes. They'll have to speak to them.
And one more on this. Regional countries such as Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar condemned Israel's seizure of Golden Heights. Actually, we just had a fragile ceasefire agreement recently in Lebanon. And are you not concerned about Israel's actions like occupation of Golan Heights and recent attacks on Damascus, which regional countries also perceive as a provocation?
So I already spoke to the situation on the border. I don't have any further comment on that.
I'm not going to declare those celebrating the fall of Assad wrong or say those defending Assad right. That's not the purpose of this video. What I'm going to do in this video is present facts, some hard facts that people on both sides of the spectrum are either choosing to ignore or are simply unaware of. Once again, I'm going to raise plenty of questions about the glaring double standards and hypocrisy of the West. Let's first look at Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the organization which is now being celebrated by the West and even some of its critics. These are the same critics who have slammed the West for its role in Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. I know all about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and how it has evolved over the years. That's what I've been doing for a living, reporting on the Middle East both during my time in the BBC and even after I left the organization. But wouldn't it be better if I quoted the US government about the individuals running this organization? This is what the US government, mind you, US government's Counter-Terrorism Intelligence Center wrote about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. According to them, and I quote, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a coalition of northern Syria-based Sunni Islamist insurgent groups that evolved from Jabhat Al-Nusrah or Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda's former branch in Syria. End of quote. The US government had announced a bounty of $10 million on the head of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the head of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, currently being tipped to become the next president of Syria. But for this former MI6 head, Jawlani is halal now.
When I was chief of MI6 10, 12 years ago, we looked at all these Syrian opposition groups and classified them into those that we could support and those who were beyond the pale and too close to Al-Qaeda. And Tahrir al-Sham was definitely in the latter category. But I think Abu Muhammad al-Julani, the leader, has made great efforts over the last 10 years to distance himself from those terrorist groups. And certainly the actions we've seen of Tahrir al-Sham over the last 2 weeks has been those of a liberation movement, not of a terrorist organization. And so I think the Home Secretary will be asking the MI5 and the Joint Terrorism Assessment Center for a review of the situation about Tahrir al-Sham and whether it should remain on the prescribed entity list. It would be rather ridiculous, actually, if we're unable to engage with the new leadership in Syria because of a prescription dating back 12 years.
Now let's look at other historical facts. And mind you, these are historical facts, not my facts. Now that we know the direct link between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the ISIS, I would like you to know the historical relationship between the ISIS and Israel. The same ISIS that the US says it's been bombing in Syria to justify its illegal military offensives there. Speaking to Mehdi Hassan on Al Jazeera's program Upfront way back in 2016, Ephraim Halevi, former head of Israeli Mossad, has said that he was not concerned that Israel had treated fighters in Syria from Al-Nusrah Front, which is essentially Al-Qaeda's Syrian branch. In his words, and I quote, "It's always useful to deal with your enemies in a humane way." End of quote. When Mehdi Hassan pressed him on whether he believed the assistance that Israel was providing was purely humanitarian, this former Mossad chief responded, and I quote, "I didn't say there is no tactical consideration. I said the main consideration, the immediate consideration, is humane." End of quote. Halevi, however, made it absolutely clear that his country would not support the treatment of wounded Hezbollah fighters because Israel had been targeted by Hezbollah but not specifically targeted by Al-Qaeda. Watch it for yourself.
There have been reports that Israel has been treating wounded Syrian rebel fighters in its hospitals on the border, including fighters from Nusra Front, which is, of course, the Al-Qaeda proxy in Syria. Do those reports worry you that Israel's helping wounded Al-Qaeda-aligned fighters?
As I said before, in a different context, it's always useful also to deal with your enemies in a humane way. And I think that when you have people who are wounded and you can deal with them in a humane way, the considerations as to whether to take them in are not simply whether it's politically useful or whether it's politically
So it's purely humanitarian, you say? So there's no tactical or political strategic...
I didn't say there's no tactical. I said the main consideration, the immediate consideration is humane.
But the tactical issues involved, I mean, you know better than me the phrase blowback. You don't think there's going to be blowback against Israel if you get into bed with a group like Nusra Front?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's going to be blowback.
Why?
Because I think that, unfortunately, the rules of the game in Syria are such that you can do anything that is not possible to be done anywhere else.
Yeah, I think people said that in Afghanistan too. Would you also treat Hezbollah fighters?
No, I would not treat...
Have you not just contradicted what you told me 60 seconds ago about humanely treating your enemies?
No. I think as far as Hezbollah fighters are concerned, with them we have a different account.
So let me be clear, you're happy to treat Al-Qaeda fighters, but not Hezbollah fighters?
We have a different account with Hezbollah, a totally different account, because Hezbollah has carried out the type of actions against us which preclude us from going into what the Al-Qaeda has done. Al-Qaeda, to the best of my recollection, has up to now not attacked Israel.
So Al-Qaeda, ISIS and Nusra fighters all have been kosher for Israelis despite they being designated as terrorists by Americans but not Hezbollah. Now you draw your own conclusion. But wait, I'm not done yet. Al-Nusrah, or the Front for the Defense of the Syrian People, according to the BBC, first announced its existence with a video posted online in January 2012. Al-Nusrah in Syria then merged with Al-Qaeda in 2013. Al-Nusrah's pledge of allegiance to Al-Qaeda had come in April 2013, just days after Al-Qaeda's leader Ayman al-Zawahiri called on jihadis, his word, not mine, to do everything possible to bring about an Islamic state in Syria. Soon, the Al-Nusrah Front's official website began to post official messages from Al-Qaeda leaders. In the statement, the group had then said that it was behind many of the suicide bombings that had rocked Syria since the uprising began in March 2011. Now, 2011 was quite a crucial year. It was the year of uprising across the Middle East. This was the time when hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in Cairo's Tahrir Square in Egypt to topple Hosni Mubarak, a brutal dictator. Mubarak's fall paved the way for Egypt's first democratic elections, and a man called Mohamed Morsi was elected as the new president. You have to know this to understand the glaring hypocrisy of the Americans and Israelis in Syria. Assad is said to be brutal, which he was, but so was Egypt's Mubarak. But Mubarak was an American ally. So is Al-Sisi, the current president of Egypt, or should I say, the dictator of Egypt, who came to power by first imprisoning Morsi and then carrying out the massacre of his own people, before killing Morsi in prison. Just Google Rabaa massacre to understand what Al-Sisi did to slaughter his own people outside the 4 mosques in Cairo on the night of 14th of August 2013. I was a witness to this shameful chapter of history, covering the event for the BBC. This crushed the uprising in Egypt, as those protesting against Al-Sisi did not get any military support from the US or Israelis the way the rogue regimes of the US and Israel supported members of Al-Nusrah, Al-Qaeda, and the ISIS in Syria. So when you are shedding tears for democracy and human rights in Syria, you should have had a similar approach to the dissidents in Egypt as well. In fact, the US has been providing close to a whopping $2 billion worth aid every year to Egypt. Egypt is the second largest beneficiary of the US aid after Israel, despite the country's regime being notorious for its brutality against its own people. So Mohamed Morsi was allowed to be toppled and killed because he refused to support Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. But Al-Sisi is a good dictator, since he loves Netanyahu and he has absolutely no problem with Israelis carrying out the massacre of Palestinians and has opened the doors for Zionists to freely enter Egypt to rejuvenate themselves after the exhaustion of their killing spree in Gaza, the occupied West Bank, and Lebanon. The former Mossad head wasn't the only person confirming the special relationship between Israel and designated terrorist organizations in Syria. A report by no less than the UN in 2015 had revealed that the Israeli Defense Forces had maintained regular contact with members of the ISIS since May 2013. This was also reported by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Haaretz reported how reports by the UN observers in the Golan Heights had submitted to 15 members of the Security Council detailing regular contact between IDF officers and those designated terrorists. So there was absolutely no doubt about this relationship between Israelis, Americans, and those banned so-called terrorist organizations even then, even as the US and Israelis supported members of Al-Nusrah, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS with funds, arms supply, and medical support, even though the US government publicly pretended to condemn the same groups. Are you watching, dear Americans? You are being taken for a ride. In fact, you have been taken for a ride all these years. Then there were these leaked emails in 2016, leaked emails to and from Hillary Clinton that revealed how two of the staunchest American allies, namely Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they have been funding ISIS. So if tyranny and brutality by a despot is a reason for regime change, then why no similar action against the host of similar regimes across the Gulf region? So clearly, that's not the reason. This is being fed to justify a regime change and allow Israelis to illegally annex more land in the region to become the undisputed superpower in the Middle East. Tell me, why have American and Israeli jets bombed Damascus even after the fall of Assad? Why has Israel grabbed more Syrian territory beyond the Golan Heights that it already illegally occupies immediately after the fall of Al-Assad?
Breaking news on Syria, and this time related to Israel, and Israeli airstrikes are being reported by Reuters, saying that Israel has targeted customs headquarters and military intelligence in a security complex in the Kafr Sousa district of Damascus.
This is what a minister in the Keir Starmer government here in the UK, Pat McFadden, told Sky News.
The United States, we know, has bombed some targets inside Syria over the last 24 hours. Israel has done the same. Where does that leave the UK? Do you fully support the action that they have been taking?
What I think Israel's doing is making sure its position in the Golan is secure. One of the things to note about this has partly happened because of Israeli action against Iranian proxies around the region, and that has left Iran weakened, and that is partly why the Assad regime has fallen. So the action that Israel has taken over the last few days will be to make sure that its position in the Golan is secure.
So that's supported by the UK?
We will always support Israel's right to defend itself and make itself secure.
And for those celebrating that Syria will finally prosper after the fall of Assad, watch Steve Peters, an outspoken American broadcaster.
Before this war, Syria had the biggest population of Christians in the entire Middle East, and those Christians enjoyed full citizenship, unlike they do in Israel. Syria, before 2011, was a modern country with a thriving culture, a good economy. But all of that changed when it was marked for destruction because its leader, Bashar Al-Assad, wouldn't grovel to Israel. Wouldn't let the international Rothschild-run banking cartel gut his nation. And so they decided to take him out. Just like Saddam Hussein. Just like Muammar Gaddafi. And now Assad is the last one standing until you get to Iran.
Clip. I have been consistent with my stand on tyranny and despots. What about you? You must also ask these questions to yourself before celebrating the goings-on in Syria. You only have to look at the so-called liberation of people in Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq to understand what these liberations have done to the economy and the safety and the lives of those people living in these countries. That's it from me. Thank you for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you too think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should consider becoming part of it. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.